And so we return. This is video 14 in the series in which I recite my English translation of Jenseits von Gut und Böse, Vorspiel, einer Philosophie der Zukunft by Friedrich Nietzsche, which I have translated as Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. My name is Joseph Suglia, S-U-G-L-I-A. We left off with the 9th section of the book, which is entitled, What is Distinguished? The word which I have translated as distinguished in the German is Vornehm, V-O-R-N-E-H-M. I have variously translated this word, Vornehm, as distinguished, distinctive, dignified, elegant, sophisticated, and noble, although noble is very close to the German edel, and sophisticated is very close to the German fortgeschritten. How I translate the word Vornehm is dependent on the context in which it is situated. We left off with paragraph 257. So 9th section, what is distinguished? What is Vornehm? 257. Any elevation of the human, in quotes, type has been the work of aristocratic society, and so shall it ever be. An aristocracy is a society that believes in the long ladder of hierarchy. It believes in the diversity of values between one human being and another. And it believes that slavery in some form is always necessary. A pathos of distance arises from the incarnate difference between the classes, the constant looking beyond and looking down of the dominant classes upon their subordinates and tools, and the just as constant practice of obedience and commanding, the holding down and holding away. Without this pathos of distance, that other, more mysterious form of pathos could not grow. The demand for an ever greater distance, the demand for an ever greater widening of distance within the soul itself, the continual formation of ever higher, ever rarer, ever remoter, ever broader, ever more expansive states of the soul. Basically, the very elevation of the human, in quotes, type, the continuous, quote, self-overcoming of the human being, end of quotation, to assimilate a moralistic formula into a supra-moral sense. Indeed, do not allow yourself to give in to any of the humanitarian deceptions concerning the history of the development of aristocratic societies. Such a society is thus the presupposition of the elevation of the human, in quotes, type. The truth is hard. Let us tell the story without sparing anyone's feelings of the way that every higher culture on earth has begun. Those who still have a natural nature, those who are barbarians in the terrible sense of that word, those rapacious predators who are still in possession of the seamless force of will and the desire for mastery. They pounce upon those who are weaker, more civilized, more peaceful. Perhaps they pounce upon those who belong to the merchant races or the cattle breeding races. Perhaps they pounce upon those who belong to ancient, delicate cultures, whose final burst of vitality flickered out in a glittering firework spectacle of spirit and corruption. And parenthetically here, Nietzsche is alluding to the sack of Rome in August of 410 of the Christian era, in which the Visigoths, a so-called barbarian tribe, invaded and overthrew ancient Rome, which was no longer at that time the center of Western civilization anyway, but that center had been further displaced by the raid of the Visigoths. And just to be clear, this is something that is sometimes glossed over. There were many sacks of Rome subsequent to the 410 Christian era sack of Rome. There were many sacks of Rome, many invasions into Rome, many incursions into Rome on the part of the so-called barbarians. The distinguished caste, forename, was originally the barbarian caste. The superiority of the barbarian resided not primarily in his or her physical force, but rather in his or her soulful force. Soulful force. The barbarian was the more complete human being, which meant at that stage the more complete beast. 258. Corruption is the expression of the instincts which are threatening anarchy. Corruption is also the expression that the fundamental structure of affects with an A, which we call life, has been destabilized. Corruption means something fundamentally different, depending on the life form in which it shows itself. If, for example, an aristocracy, such as the French aristocracy at the beginning of the Revolution, throws away its privileges in a gesture of sublime nausea and sacrifices itself to an excessiveness of moralistic feeling, this is corruption. It was actually only the concluding act of the enduring corruption of the 18th century, in which the aristocracy gradually surrendered its dominant authority and deposed itself to a function of the kingdom, and finally became the bauble and the ornament of that kingdom. The most essential thing about a good and healthy aristocracy is, though, that it should not feel as if it were a function, whether it be of the kingdom, whether it be of the communality. The essential thing about a good and healthy aristocracy is that it feels as if it were the sense and the highest justification of the kingdom, of the communality, etc. It is essential for this reason that the aristocracy accept the self-sacrifice of an indeterminate number of human beings with good conscience, human beings who must be oppressed and reduced to incompleteness, to slaves, to instruments in the service of the aristocracy. Its fundamental belief must be that the society is not permitted to its fundamental belief must be that the society is not permitted to exist for the sake of society. Rather, the fundamental belief of the aristocracy must be that society exists merely as the substratum and scaffolding for the sake of an exceptional type of human being. Its fundamental belief must be that society exists merely in order to empower the exceptional type of human being, to allow the exceptional type of human being to elevate to his or her higher task and to his or her higher being. This is comparable to that heliotropic Javanese climbing plant called Sipo matador, wrapping its arms around the oak tree. This plant climbs relentlessly and for so long until it finally comes to the top of the oak and, propped upon the oak's highest branches, unfolds its corolla in the free light and displays its happiness. 259. Sharing injury, violation, exploitation, positing one will as equal to another's. These can be considered good manners between individuals. Good manners understood in the colloquial sense, if the right conditions are there. The right conditions would be the actual similarity in strength and value of two individuals and the co-belonging of the aforementioned experiences within a single body. However, as soon as one wants to assume this principle and make it, wherever possible, the foundational principle of a society, then the principle of sharing grievances and equalizing wills shows itself for what it is. It is the will to negate life. It is the principle of dissolution and disintegration. Here you have to think thoroughly and rationally and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriating, damaging, dominating the strange and the weak, oppressing, imposing one's own forms on others, incorporating, being severe, and at the very least, in the mildest of cases, exploiting. But why must we use such old words, words from an age that imprinted them with a defamatory meaning? As we presupposed above, even within a body that treats bodies that are like it as equal, and this happens in every healthy aristocracy, such a body will behave toward bodies that are different from it in a way that it refrains from behaving when it encounters bodies that are similar to it. That is, if that body is a living body and not a dying body, the body of the aristocrat must be the corporeal will to power. It will grow, it will expand, it will draw to itself. It will desire supremacy, not out of some kind of morality or immorality, but rather because it lives, and because life itself is the very will to power. Nowhere is the vulgar consciousness of the European more resistant to education than it is here. Everywhere these days, people are raving, all while wearing scientific clothes. They are raving about the conditions of a future society which will abolish its exploitive character. To my ears, that sounds as if they were promising to invent a life that abstains from developing any organic functions. Exploitation, in quotes, does not belong to a corrupt or incomplete or primitive society. No, it belongs to the essence of the living itself as its basic organic function. Exploitation is the consequence of the actual will to power, which is the very will to life. Granted, this is a new theory. In reality, it is the fact of all history. At the very least, let us be honest about it. For those who know German, when I wrote, they are raving, that was my translation of man schwärmt. Man schwärmt. So here Nietzsche is alluding to Schwärmerei, right? The Schwärmer. 260. As I wander through the coarser and more sophisticated morals that have dominated this earth, or that still dominate the earth, I have found that certain traits regularly repeat themselves and bind themselves to other traits. At last, two basic types were revealed. Two basic types were revealed, and a basic distinction emerged. There is master morality and slave morality. Let me add that in all higher and synthetic cultures, there appears the attempt to intermediate both forms of morality. Even more often, the two moralities are confused with each other, and reciprocal misunderstandings arise. Indeed, you sometimes find them starkly juxtaposed, even within the same person, even within the same soul. Moral value distinctions originate either from the dominating type, which takes pleasure in its difference from the dominated type. The dominating type takes pleasure in its difference from the dominated type. Or from the dominated type, slaves and dependents of every degree. In the first case, if it is the dominators who determine, and determine well, the concept of morality, the sublime and proud states of the soul will be felt as the most distinctive and hierarchical states. The distinguished person, der vornehme Mensch in the German. The distinguished person divides himself or herself from those creatures who express the contrary of such elevated, proud states of the soul. He or she has contempt for them. It becomes immediately apparent that in the first form of morality, the opposition between good and evil means the same as the opposition between distinguished and contemptible, between vornehm and verächtlich, right? Vornehm, distinguished, verächtlich, contemptible. The opposition between good and evil comes from a different origin. Contemptible, verächtlich, will be the cowardly, the nervous, the trifling, whoever thinks of his or her own restricted utility. Even more contemptible are the mistrustful person with his unfree glances, the self-denigrating person, the canine type of human who allows himself to be mistreated, the smarmy beggar, and above all, the liar. Such is the fundamental belief of all aristocrats. The common people are mendacious. We truthful ones. This is how the nobility of ancient Greece named itself. It is obvious that moral valuations were first derived from people and only later derived from actions. For this reason, it is an awful mistake when the moral historians begin their inquiries with the question, why do we praise acts that are done from pity? The distinguished type of human being, the forename type of human being, right, feels himself or herself to be determinative of value. He or she does not need approval. He or she judges. What is injurious to me is injurious to myself. No. What is injurious to me is injurious in itself. By the way, just an illusion. It is very clear that Nietzsche knew his Sterner. He certainly read Max Sterner. And we know this if we read the book translated as Conversations with Nietzsche, edited by Sander Gilman. If you read the testimony of Frau Overbeck, you will know that Nietzsche certainly read Max Sterner. Anyway, he or she judges what is injurious to me is injurious in itself. He or she knows himself or herself as the one who confers honor to things in the first place, the master, right? The master accords honor to things, but also the master gives value to things. And most importantly of all, the master accords meaning to the world. The master is the giver of meaning. He or she, the master, is creative of value. Everything that he or she recognizes in himself or herself is honored. Such morality is a form of self-glorification, of course. In the foreground is the feeling of plenitude, the feeling of a power that wants to overflow. The happiness that comes from the feeling of high tension. The consciousness of a wealth that wants to give and to squander. Even the distinguished person, der vornehme Mensch, helps the misfortunate, but never or almost never out of pity. Rather, he or she does so from the feeling of pressure that is produced by the overflow of power. The distinguished person, der vornehme Mensch, honors the mightiness within himself, or honors the mightiness within herself. He or she honors as well the one who exerts power over oneself, parenthetically, such as Marcus Aurelius, right? The emperor of Rome at that time, who supplicated himself before, who prostrated himself before a Greek slave known as Epictetus. Why? Not to be reductive, not to simplify, but because Epictetus had mastery over himself and could teach Marcus Aurelius, the leader of the free world back then, how to master himself. The distinguished person, der vornehme Mensch, honors the one who knows when to speak and when to keep silent. He or she honors the one who applies rigor and severity to oneself. Wotan put a hard heart in my breast. So goes an ancient Scandinavian saga. This was rightly poeticized from the soul of a proud Viking. Such a person is quite proud that he or she is not made for pity. For this reason, the hero of the saga admonishes, whoever does not have a hard heart when young will never be hard. Those who are distinguished, vornehm, and audacious, and who think in such a manner are the furthest away from that morality that sees pity or acting for the benefit of others, or
désintéressement.
Merci, Simone. Merci. That means selflessness. As its distinctive traits, belief in oneself, pride in oneself, and a fundamentally adversarial and ironic position toward selflessness, in quotes, of course, belong to a distinguished form of morality. So does the gentle deprecation of one's inferiors and the reluctance to be empathic, as well as the reluctance to have a warm heart, in quotation marks. The mighty are those who know how to honor. It is their art, their realm of sensation, the profound reverence toward age and tradition. The whole of justice rests upon this double reverence, and the belief in and the preference for one's ancestors, and the disinclination toward the approaching generations. These things are typical of the morality of the powerful. Conversely, if people of modern ideas believe almost instinctually in progress and the future, and are ever more lacking in reverence for age, this reveals the undistinguished origin of these ideas, right? Die unvornehme Herkunft, right? The undistinguished source, the undistinguished heritage, the undistinguished provenance of these ideas. For the most part, however, the morality of the dominant is alien to contemporary tastes. Its fundamental propositions are considered to be uncomfortable in their stringency, that one only has duties toward one's equals, that one may behave toward creatures of inferior rank, and toward anything strange as one pleases, or as the heart desires. In any event, one is permitted to act toward such creatures beyond good and evil. Pity and other such things may belong here. The capacity and the obligation to practice long-term gratitude and long-term vengeance, both only practiced among one's equals, refinement in retaliation, conceptual refinement in friendship, a certain necessity to have enemies. Notice what Nietzsche is saying here. One's enemies are one's friends are one's enemies. Enemies are, as it were, the ditches or the affects of envy, rivalry, arrogance. Basically, in order to be able to be a good friend, such ditches are needed. All are the typical characteristics of the morality of distinction, which, as indicated above, is not the morality of modern ideas, and which is therefore difficult to sympathize with today. It is also difficult these days to excavate and to uncover the morality of the distinguished. Things stand otherwise with the second type of morality, slave morality. Suppose that the violated, the oppressed, the suffering, the unfree, the insecure, and the fatigued are moralizing. What would their moral valuations be? Probably a pessimistic distrust of the whole situation of humanity would be expressed. Perhaps a judgment of human beings together with their situation. The gaze of the slave is disadvantageous to the virtues of the powerful. The slave is skeptical and mistrustful. He is subtly mistrustful of anything that is revered as good on the side of the masters, right? He would like to persuade himself that their fortune is not genuine. Inversely, those traits that serve to alleviate the conditions of suffering are drawn out and suffused with light. This is where reverence for pity, the accommodating and serviceable hand, the warm heart, patience, sedulousness, humility, and friendliness come in. These are the most utile properties and nearly the only means of withstanding the pressures of existence. Slave morality is essentially the morality of usefulness. Here, the herd is the origin of the famous opposition between good and evil. Powerfulness and dangerousness will be felt within evil. A certain formidableness, refinement, and strength which stunt any incoherent contempt. According to slave morality, then, evil inspires fear. According to master morality, it is precisely the good which inspires fear and which desires to inspire fear, while the bad person will be felt as contemptible. The opposition reaches its zenith when, as the consequence of slave morality, the scent of deprecation clings to the idea of good, no matter how gentle and benevolent it might be. For good, according to the slavish way of thinking, is, in any event, the person who is incapable of danger, right? The weak person is considered to be good, according to the second form of morality. The person who is incapable of harming, the person who is incapable of hurting anyone, the nice person is considered good. That is to say, harmless. That is to say, impotent, not dangerous. Incapable of retaliation, that's what he means. Parenthetically, this is just me. This is I, parenthesizing. He is good-natured, easy to deceive, right? Manipulable. He is manipulable. He is subjudgeable, right? That is to say, he can be easily subjugated. He is good-natured, easy to deceive, perhaps a little dumb, un bonhomme, a good man, a good person. Everywhere in which the slave morality dominates, the words good and dumb come closer together in the language, right? And the intelligent are decried as evil, right? The powerful are decried as evil. The last basic distinction, the longing for liberty, the instinct for happiness, and the intricacies of the feeling of freedom belong as necessarily to slave morals and morality as art and exalted reverence and exalted obeisance belong as regular symptoms to an aristocratic way of thinking and valuating. On this basis, it becomes immediately evident why love as passion, our European specialty, must have an absolutely distinguished source, right? And here Nietzsche is alluding to the history of love. Love is not timeless. Love has a history. Love has a beginning, and love has an end. Love is a concept, and all concepts are formed in time, and all concepts have a beginning, and all concepts have an end. Plutarch was immensely influential to the formation of the concept of romantic love, which we will be talking about next month. I don't know when you're going to be watching this and listening to this, but in my next video series, which will concern Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, I will discuss the history of the concept of love. And here Nietzsche is going to be talking about the concept of Geissaber, the gay science, which originally meant the art of love songs and the art of composing love poetry that was practiced by 14th century Provençal troubadours. And the 14th century Provençal troubadour concept of romantic love formed our contemporary concept of love. It is the origin of our concept of love. What we think of as romantic love and of romance is intimately indebted to the concept of the 14th century Provençal troubadours. But let's continue. As is well known, the invention of love as passion belongs to the Provençal chivalric poets, to those magnificently inventive people of the Geissaber, to whom Europe owes so much gratitude, and to which Europe owes almost its very existence. 261. One of the things that are perhaps most difficult for distinguished people, right? Those who are forename. One of the things that are perhaps most difficult for distinguished people to understand is vanity. Why? Because distinguished people, free spirits, are strong and they are proud. And a proud person derives meaning from within. A proud person feels that he or she is something, and perhaps even everything, if he or she is a megalomaniac, but let's just say something. A proud person feels that he or she is something, and that everyone else might be nothing, or could possibly be nothing, and it doesn't matter to the proud person. But what is a vain person? Well, a vain person only sees himself or herself through the eyes of other human beings. The vain person is dependent on the gazes of others. The vain person derives his or her meaning from other human beings who surround him or her. So the vain person feels that he or she is nothing and everyone else is everything. I need those Instagram likes in order to feel valuable. That is the motto of the vain person. So a distinguished person, ein vornehmer Mensch, will never comprehend vanity. How could he or she? How is that possible? So first, they will attempt to deny its existence, whereas another kind of person will grasp it with both hands. The problem for the distinguished person is to imagine a creature who seeks to awaken a good impression of itself in others, the vain person, right? An impression that it does not have of itself. The vain person doesn't love himself or herself, right? An impression that is also unearned. And afterward, this vain creature is supposed to believe this good impression itself, right? Because the good impression is produced by other people, or maybe the negative impression is produced by other people, and then the vain person conforms to those pre-existing impressions that are generated by the crowd. To a distinguished person, all of this seems somewhat distasteful. and dishonorable to one's own self. It also seems so baroquely irrational that the distinguished person would rather see vanity as something rare and doubt of its existence in most of the cases in which it is brought up. It's just some oddment. It's nothing more than an oddment, right? It exists on the fringes of society. That's what a distinguished person wants to believe. Because the distinguished person cannot conceive vanity. He will say, or she will say, for instance, I might be mistaken about my own worth, or I might demand to be recognized by others, but that isn't vanity. That isn't vanity. No, rather, it's a kind of benightedness, right? Or more commonly, it is what people call humility or modesty, right? Or even, I can be happy about the good impression that others have of me, sure. For all kinds of reasons, really. Perhaps because I honor and love them and I enjoy their enjoyment. Perhaps also because their good impression of me highlights my good impression of myself and strengthens it, right? Highlights my pre-existing, my self-formed good impression of myself. That has to be made clear. Perhaps because the good impression that others have of me, even in cases where I disagree, is just useful to me or promises some future usefulness. It is only through compulsion, that is, by studying history, that the distinguished person conceives how, from time immemorial, the common person only was what he was considered to be. Since he is not at all accustomed to posit values himself, he's a slave, he only ascribes values to himself that his masters have ascribed to him. The creation of values is the proper right of the masters. As the consequence of a massive atavism, the ordinary person will always just wait until an impression is made of him, and then he will instinctively subjugate himself to that impression. Certainly not just a good impression, but also a bad and unfair impression. Think, for example, of the majority of self-estimates and self-underestimates that credulous women learn from their father confessors. Think of the self-estimates and self-underestimates that the credulous Christian learns from his church, basically in keeping with the gradual approach of the democratic order of things, and its source, the common sanguinity of masters and slaves. The original impulse of the distinguished is rare and is being encouraged more and more and is disseminated ever more widely. To ascribe to oneself value and to think well of oneself. In each epoch, however, the impulse of the rare and the distinguished is countered by a more ancient, more extensive, and more fundamentally embodied tendency. That is the phenomenon of vanity. And this older tendency, vanity, will master the newer tendency to give oneself value and to think well of oneself. The vain person enjoys every good impression that people have of him, every good impression about him that he hears, completely beside the question of whether or not that impression is true or false, and regardless of any usefulness such a positive impression might have. So the vain person doesn't care whether or not what people say about him is true or false. He only cares, or she only cares, if the crowd says something positive about him or her. That's all the vain person cares about. And the vain person just cares whether or not the praise is useful or not. In the same manner, he suffers from every negative impression that people have of him. Right. The vain person would bleed to death from a paper cut because you just insult that person slightly, or you slight that person in an insulting way. The vain person will crumble at that point. For he subjugates himself to both of these impressions, the positive and the negative. He feels himself subjugated to them, And this comes from that most ancient of instincts, the instinct to be subjudgeable, the instinct to be a slave. The will to be a slave is the most ancient instinct. That's what Nietzsche is suggesting here. And it is the instinct to be subjudgeable that bursts within him. It is the slave that is in the blood of the vain person, a residue of the slyness of the slave, right? It's a form of atavism. It's atavistic. And how much slave is still regressive within woman, for example. I'm not going to read that part. Along the same lines, the slave is the one who prostrates himself before the positive opinion that the master has of him after the fact, as if he were not the one who summoned the positive opinion to begin with. And to say it once more, vanity is a kind of atavism. I disavow all sexism in Nietzsche. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. However, I have written about Nietzsche's crypto-feminism elsewhere. Read my essay on Human All Too Human. Paragraph 262, a species emerges. A type of creature is stabilized and strengthened when it is placed again and again under the same unfavorable circumstances. Contrariwise, it is known from the experience of breeders that species which receive a superabundance of nourishment and an excess of care and protection will incline toward the strongest variation of type. Such species which receive an excess of nourishment, care, and protection will be rich in aberrations and monstrosities, also in monstrous vices. Now look at an aristocratic communality, such as the Greek polis or Venice, as if it were an intentional or unintentional breeding institution. There are people who rely on one another as a form of perseverance, mostly because they persevere or else run the risk of becoming extirpated. Here, every advantage is lacking, every form of excess, every kind of safeguard that would favor species variation. A species becomes necessary as a species only if it can assert itself and become permanent in its constant struggle against its neighbors, or against the revolt threatening oppressed, or against insurrection. A species becomes necessary as a species only on account of its hardness, consistency, and simplicity of form. The multiplicities of experience teach the dominant members of a species to which qualities it chiefly owes its existence. Despite all divinity and humanity, it is still there. Despite all divinity and humanity, it has always had the upper hand. The dominant members of the species call these qualities virtues. Only virtues make the species great, according to the dominant caste. If it is done severely, severity is desired. Every form of aristocratic morality is intolerant in the way that it educates its youth, in its conjugal customs, in its relations between the old and the young, in its penal laws, which alone have the aberrant in their gaze. The dominant members of the species count intolerance itself as a virtue, and they give it the name justice, a type with a few strong features. A species of stringent, bellicist, taciturn, closed off, and locked away human beings, and are such from the most sophisticated feelings for the enchantments and the nuances of society. In this way, a society will be solidified above the tumult of generations. The cause of the stabilization and the strengthening of society is, as I said above, the constant struggle with ever identical unfavorable circumstances. At last, however, a favorable situation emerges, a favorable situation that slackens the tremendous tension. Perhaps the neighbors are no longer adversaries, and the means to live, even the enjoyment of life, are in fertile abundance. With a single stroke, the bonds and the compulsions of the old disciplinary norms are rent. The members of the species no longer feel themselves as necessary, as existentially conditioned. If the species wants to continue, it can only do so in the guise of luxury, of archaic taste, whether it takes the form of aberration into the loftier, the more refined, the rarer, or of degeneracy and monstrosity. No, or of degeneracy and monstrosity, variation suddenly exists in the greatest plenitude and splendor, right there as a spectacle. Now the individual dares to be individual. Now the individual dares to take off. At these turns of history, side by side, and often entangled and strangled, there is a majestic, multifarious, primordial jungle-like proliferation and towering, a tropical tempo in the rivalry of growth, and a tremendous devastation and going down to the ground, thanks to, as it were, the wildly turned against one another, exploding egoisms that wrestle with one another for sun and light and derive no border, no reign, no safeguard from the previous morality. It was the morality itself which accumulated its energy to such monstrous proportions. It was the morality itself that tensed the bow in such a threatening manner. Now it is, now it will survive. The ghostly, threatening point has been reached. The point at which a greater, more multitudinous, more expansive life lives beyond the old morality. The individual stands there, compelled to its own legislation, to its own artifices, to the cunning of self-preservation, self-heightening, self-redemption. Nothing but new for what purposes? Nothing but new by this means is. No more formulae that are held in common. Misunderstanding is bound to disrespect. Decline, decomposition, and the highest desires are terribly entangled. The genius of the race is overflowing from all of the cornucopias, of the good and the awful, the catastrophic simultaneity of spring and autumn, flush with new stimulations and veils that are characteristic of a fresh corruption, a corruption that is yet unexhausted, that is not yet depleted. Again, the danger is there, the mother of morality, the great danger, this time transferred to an individual, to one's intimates and friends, on the street to one's own child, to one's own heart, in everything that is ownmost, and one's own secret desires and volitions. What will the future moral philosophers have to sermonize about? They will discover, these sharp-eyed observers and slackers, that it will all soon come to an end, that everything around them will wreck and be wrecked, that nothing will be standing the day after tomorrow, except for a certain kind of human being, the incurably mediocre, right? And to say it once more parenthetically, Nietzsche is here suggesting the idiotization of modern culture, the mediocritization of modern culture, the stupidification of modern culture is making the growth of higher human beings, exceptional human beings, strong, powerful, intelligent, the free spirits, very difficult and almost impossible. It is almost impossible for such a beautiful flower to grow out of, to germinate from a hill of pig feces. The mediocre alone have the promise of persistence, of propagation. It is they who are the people of the future, the only ones who will survive. And for those of you who are deeply interested in Nietzsche, I believe Nietzsche here is alluding to one of his own prophecies and creations. Although it's, well, Nietzsche foresees the last human beings. And the last human beings are those who have no desires and who feel no dissatisfaction at all with the modern world. They are self-complacent. They don't know what longing is. They don't know what greatness is. They don't know what intelligence is. They are not merely mediocre, but they are satisfied by their mediocrity. As I've written elsewhere, and the mediocre shall inherit the earth. It is they who are the people of the future. The only ones who will survive. The mediocre are the only ones who will survive. They're like a weed that ever proliferates, that ever expands and englobes the planet. It is an all-englobing growth, vegetative growth, a weed. The mediocre alone have the promise of persistence and of propagation, and they will strangle all of the beautiful flowers, all of the beautiful plants. Be like us, become mediocre, is now considered the only morality that still makes sense, that still finds ears to listen to it. Right, because they want to pull down the truly exceptional human beings to their level. And they want to raise themselves up as the measure, as the standard, as the norm, the mediocre do. But this morality of mediocrity is difficult to sermonize. It may never admit what it is and what it wants. It must speak of measure and dignity and duty and love for one's nature. It will need to bury irony, of course, right? The mediocre are literal-minded. They can't understand irony. Irony is a willful disingenuousness. Irony means feigning innocence, feigning ignorance. That's what the Greek word means, ironia. The mediocre are incapable of that because they have dependent minds. They have literal minds. They're not capable of thinking for themselves. And of course they can never admit that they're mediocre. Of course they won't openly glorify mediocrity. How could they? That would be a self-canceling project, a self-negating project. 263. The instinct for rank is more than anything already the mark of a high rank. The pleasure that one takes in the nuances of honor suggests that such a person has a distinguished heritage, a forename heritage, and is a person of distinguished habits, right? Habits that are forename. The preciousness, kindliness, and loftiness of a soul will be dangerously put to the test whenever it encounters something that is of the first rank, but which is not yet guarded from invasive groping and vulgarity by the shutters of authority. Something that is passing by, going its way, unmarked, undiscovered, trying new things out, perhaps intentionally veiled and disguised, as if it were a living touchstone. Anyone who is charged with the task and exercise of investigating such souls will use this art in many of its forms to establish the ultimate value of such a soul, to identify the inexorable, innate hierarchy to which it belongs. The investigator will test his subject's instinct for honor.
Différence en genre haine.
Merci, Simone. Merci bien. Difference engenders hatred is what that means. Many natures have a commonness, Gemeinheit in the German, that suddenly sprays forth as if it were filthy water whenever some kind of holy vessel, some kind of treasure from a secluded shrine, some kind of a book that bears the signs of a tremendous destiny is carried over. On the other hand, there is an unwitting muteness, a hesitation in the eyes, a silencing of every gesture which expresses that a soul feels the proximity of something that is most worthy of reverence. All things considered, the way in which respect for the Bible has been maintained in Europe is the most impressive fragment of discipline and refinement of manners that Europe owes to Christendom. Such books of depth and ultimate significance require an external tyranny of authority for their protection, to give them the millennia of longevity that are requisite in order to unpack them and unpuzzle them. Much will have been accomplished when the vast crowd, shallow minds and quick digesters of all stripes, is finally trained to stop touching everything. A great deal will have been achieved when they are trained to understand that there are sacred experiences that demand the removal of shoes and the prohibition of unclean hands. This training is almost the pinnacle of humanity. In contrast, as far as the so-called educated class is concerned, the believers in modern ideas, perhaps nothing is more nauseating than their lack of shame, the complacent impudence of their eyes and their hands, which touch, lick, and fondle everything. These days there is possibly a greater elegance, Vornehmheit, of taste and tactful respectfulness, relatively speaking, amid the peasantry than amid the newspaper-reading demi-monde of the spirit, the educated class. 264. What one's ancestors did with the greatest constancy and love should never be effaced from the soul of a human being. Perhaps they were assiduous savers of money and the accessories of a writing desk and a money box, modest and bourgeois in their desires, modest in their virtues. Perhaps they were used to being ordered around from morning until night, from morning until night. Perhaps they were sweet on rough pleasures and even rougher duties and responsibilities. Perhaps at some point they finally sacrificed their old privileges of birth and possession in order to fully live their faith, their God, as the people of an implacable and tender conscience that is ashamed of any mediation. It is impossible that the child will not embody the properties and proclivities of his parents and ancient forebears. This is the problem of race. Assuming that you know a few things about someone's parents, you can draw a conclusion about the child. Some adverse intemperance, some sitting in a dark corner envy, some crude sanctimonious nonsense. How these three things together have always constituted the real mob type. Something along these lines will be transfused to the child as surely as if it were contaminated blood. And only with the help of the best education and enculturation will one be able to deceive oneself about such an inheritance. And what else is the point of education and enculturation these days? In our very populist, one might say, ochlocratic age, education and enculturation will have to belong to the art of deception. They exist to deceive one about one's heritage. They exist to deceive away the inherited mobbishness in one's body and soul. An educator who sermonizes truthfulness before all else. An educator who constantly bellows at his breedees, his trainees. Be truthful, be natural, show yourself for what you are. Even such a virtuous, true-hearted donkey will learn to reach for the furca of Horace in order to naturam expellare. What was the result? Mob usque recorret. 265. At the risk of offending innocent ears, I propose the following. Egoism belongs to the essence of a distinguished soul, a soul that is vornehm. By egoism, I mean our inexorable belief that other creatures will be subordinate to creatures such as we are and will sacrifice themselves to us. The distinguished soul will presuppose the fact of one's egoism without so much as a question mark. Not even with a feeling of the harshness, constrainedness, or capriciousness that comes with it. Rather, the distinguished soul will accept his or her own egoism as something that might be grounded in the primordial law of things, right? So they'll ascribe, the distinguished will ascribe their self-esteem to nature, right? Their self-image to nature, they will impose on nature, right? If they were to look for a name for this egoism without calling it as such, they would say, it is justice itself. On certain conditions, they will confess that they were hesitant at first to admit that they share equal rights with others. As soon as the question of rank comes to light, they will move among these equals and equally righted, with the same assurance of shame and tender reverence that they have when interacting with themselves. According to that secret, inborn mechanism that all stars know how to follow. This is just yet another portion of egoism, this delicacy, subtlety, and self-restraint. While in contact with others, every star is just such an egoist. Every distinguished soul honors itself in others and honors itself in the rights which it transmits to them. The egoist never doubts that the exchange of honors and rights belongs to the essence of all interaction as if it belonged to the natural state of things. The distinguished soul gives as it takes, and this exchange comes out of its impassioned and stimulable instinct for compensation, which lies at the basis of its soul, the concept of mercy inter pares, among equals, right, is nonsensical and noisome. There might be a sublime way of letting gifts come down upon you from on high and thirstily drink them up as if they were droplets of water. But a distinguished soul is unskilled in such arts and gestures. Here its egoism is an impediment. The distinguished soul does not at all enjoy looking on high. Instead, it would prefer to look laterally, horizontally, slowly, or downward. The distinguished soul is already on high, and it knows this, right? Which is why it's incapable of envy, and why it is capable of irony. Whereas the mob type is neither capable of irony, nor is it capable of pride. Number 266 is a quotation from Goethe to Ratschlosser. One can only truly esteem the one who does not search for oneself. 267. The Chinese have a saying which mothers teach their children. That means, well, literally it means small heart, but it also means be careful in Mandarin Chinese. Make your heart small. This is the actual fundamental tendency of late civilizations. I have no doubt that our self-minimization is the first thing that an ancient Greek would notice about us Europeans of today. And more than anything, it is this which would be antithetical to his taste. Now, in this next paragraph, you're going to hear the word commonness. That is my translation of die Gemeinheit. And I honestly believe that that's the only way of translating Gemeinheit. In this context, it is. Not baseness, but commonness. Die Gemeinheit. 268. What is commonness ultimately? Words are the sonic signs of concepts. Concepts, however, are the more or less definite image signs of often repeated and coalescent sensations. They are the glyphs of sensation assemblages. Using the same words is not enough for us to understand one another. We must use the same words for the same genres of inner experience. We must, in the end, hold an experience in common. Therefore, human beings within, let me read that again. Therefore, human beings within the same population understand one another better than those who belong to different populations, even if they are manipulating the same language. Or rather, when people have lived together for a long time under similar conditions, climate, soil, danger, needs, work, something comes into being, something that goes without saying, a population. In each soul, a determinate number of often repeated experiences takes the upper hand over those experiences that rarely occur. On the basis of these same experiences, we understand one another quickly and ever quicker, ever more. The history of language is the history of this process of truncation. On the basis of this quick understanding, we are bound together, tighter and ever tighter. The greater the danger, the greater is the need to come to an agreement, quickly and easily, about what needs to be done. When there is a danger, people can absolutely not dispense with the requirement of not misunderstanding one another. In every friendship or romance we administer this test, we know that nothing will endure as long as we find out that one of us feels, intends, senses, desires, fears differently than the other person, even though we are using the same words. The fear of the eternal misunderstanding. This is the well-meaning genius who so often obstructs people of different sexes from rushing into the connections to which their senses and their hearts are guiding them, and not some Schopenhauerian genius of the species, the sensation assemblages inside of a soul that are the quickest to awaken, the quickest to speak up, the quickest to speak up, the quickest to give commands, will decide the total hierarchy of its values. This hierarchy of values, in turn, will ultimately determine the soul's table of goods. A person's valuations disclose something about the structure of his or her soul and what that soul sees as the condition of its life, its real needs. The facile communicability of needs means ultimately the experiencing of average and common experiences. On the proviso that needs have only brought people together when they indicated with similar signs, similar experiences, and similar needs. The facile communicability of needs must have been the most violent of forces that has ever been imposed on human beings. Those human beings who are more ordinary and more recognizable take and have always took the advantage. Those human beings who are rarer, more exceptional, more sophisticated, and more difficult to understand have no problems staying alone. They are subject to accidents in their isolation and seldom reproduce. it is necessary to summon extraordinary counter forces in order to impede this natural, all too natural progressus in simile, the continuing education of human beings into becoming similar, ordinary, average, herd-like, and common. So it should be clear, the commoners, the common human beings, are those who can only exist within the context, within the framework of the crowd. Free spirits thrive while alone. They need to be alone. They derive their sustenance from their solitude. They have the strength to be alone because they're not dependent on anyone. That's what it means to be a free spirit. Whereas the members of the mob, the members of the crowd, of the so-called herd, require others for their sustenance. They have a deficiency within themselves. They're needy, they're parasitical, right? Whereas the free human being, the free spirit, the distinguished human being is self-subsistent, is self-sufficient, sufficient unto itself. This is Nietzsche. This is Nietzsche. 269. A congenital psychologist, someone who cannot avoid becoming a psychologist, a diviner of souls. The more such a psychologist turns his attention to exceptional cases and exceptional human beings, the greater will be the danger that he will suffocate from pity. He needs severity and cheerfulness more than anyone else. The foundering, the annihilation of higher human beings, those rare souls, is the strict rule. It is terrible always to have such a rule before one's eyes. The torment of the psychologist who discovers this annihilation, who discovers the total inner irremediableness of higher human beings, this eternal too late in every sense. The torment of the psychologist who makes this discovery before anyone else and then makes this discovery again and again, almost throughout the total course of history. This torment is multidimensional. Someday he might have the occasion to turn bitterly against his own lot and attempt his own destruction. It might happen that he himself will be ruined. In nearly every psychologist there is perceptible a treacherous preference for and pleasure in contact with ordinary and orderly people. This reveals that the psychologist forever requires a cure. This reveals that the psychologist forever requires a cure, that he or she forever needs a kind of escape and oblivion, a way out from the insights and the incisions that his or her trade has carved into his or her conscience. The fear of memory is peculiar to him or to her. He or she is easily silenced by the judgments of others. He or she listens with a motionless visage to how they revere, admire, love, transfigure what he or she has seen. Or he or she conceals his silence by expressing his or her agreement with some foreground opinion. Perhaps the paradox of his or her situation becomes so terrifying that the mob acquires a great admiration for what he or she has a mixture and contempt for what he or she has a mixture of pity and contempt for. The mob of the educated, the mob of fanatics. I mean, the admiration for those, in quotes, great men and prodigies for whose sake people bless and honor the fatherland, the earth, the dignity of humanity. Those, in quotes, great men and prodigies who are pointed out to the youth for their education. And who knows whether the same thing has not happened in every remarkable instance. The mob worships a god, and that god turns out to be a miserable, sacrificial beast. Parenthetically, for those of you who are deeply entrenched in Nietzsche, think of the donkey god, the asinine god, in Also sprach Zarathustra, right? The humanists in part 4 of Also sprach Zarathustra revere, adulate, godify a donkey. They worship a donkey god, an asinine deity. Success is always the greatest liar. Success is always the greatest liar. And the work itself is a form of success. The great statesman, the conqueror, the discoverer is camouflaged by his creations to the point of unrecognizability. The work of artists, of philosophers, invents whoever has created it, whoever should have created it. The great men, in quotes, as they are regarded, are tiny pieces of bad poetry written after the fact. Counterfeit money dominates the world of historical value. Let me read that again because it's perfect. Counterfeit money dominates the world of historical value. The great poets, for example, this Byron, Musset, Poe, Leopardi, Kleist, Gogol, they have always been people of the moment, enthusiastic, sensuous, juvenile, frivolous, and unpredictable when it comes to mistrust, frivolous and unpredictable when it comes to confidence, with souls that generally conceal some kind of fissure, often taking revenge with their work for some inner defilement, often seeking oblivion by flying away from an all too reliable memory, often getting lost in the slime and almost falling in love with it, until they become like the will-o'-the-wisps that surround the swamp and pretend to become stars. The people then call them idealists, often struggling with some enduring disgust, with the recurring specter of disbelief, which chills them and compels them to yearn for gloria and to take belief in itself from the hands of besotted flatterers and then devour it. What torment these great artists and higher human beings are for anyone who has guessed who they really are. So much is perceptible. It is precisely from... Okay. So higher human beings so easily experience outbursts of a limited pity, outbursts of the most acquiescent pity. Great artists and higher human beings, again, they experience outbursts of a limited pity, outbursts of the most acquiescent pity. Great artists and higher human beings experience so many outbursts of pity that the crowd, especially the worshiping crowd, does not understand and overloads such outbursts of pity with so many invasive and self-complacent interpretations. This pity normally deceives itself as to its strength. Alas, the one who knows the heart suspects how poor, how stupid, how helpless, how presumptuous, how misbegotten even the best love is, even the profoundest love is. Even the best and profoundest love is more likely to destroy than it is to save. It is possible that lying hidden and disguised beneath the holy fable of the life of Jesus is one of the most painful cases of the martyrdom of the knowledge about love. The martyrdom of the most innocent and yearning heart, which never had enough human love, which demanded nothing other than love and the feeling of being loved, with severity, with lunacy, with frightening outbursts against those who refused to give him love. The story of one who was so impoverished, unsatiated, and insatiable in love that he had to invent hell as a place to send those who did not want to love him. One who, finally becoming aware of human love, had to invent a God who was totally love. who was the ability to love totally, one who has mercy on human love because it is so paltry, because it is so ignorant. Whoever so feels, whoever knows such things about love, seeks death. But why indulge in such painful things unless one has to? 270. The intellectual arrogance and disgust of anyone who has ever suffered profoundly. Hierarchy is nearly determined by how deep a person is capable of suffering. He or she is certain that his or her suffering has given him or her a greater knowledge than the cleverest and wisest could ever have. And this shivering certainty supersaturates one, tinting one with its colors. One is familiar with worlds that are distant and terrible. One is sure of that. One is at home in places that you would know nothing about. This silent intellectual arrogance of the one who suffers, this pride of the exceptional person of knowledge, the initiate, almost its sacrificial figure. One requires all kinds of disguises to shield oneself from contact with intrusive, pitying hands. Indeed, from anyone who is not one's brother or sister in pain. Deep suffering makes distinctive, forename. It separates. One of the most sophisticated forms of disguise is Epicureanism and a certain ostentatious boldness and taste that takes suffering lightly and defends itself against anything sad and profound. There are cheerful people who use their cheerfulness because it allows them to be misunderstood. They want to be misunderstood. There are scientific people who use science because it gives them a cheerful appearance and because scientificity implies that a person is superficial. They want to seduce others into a false conclusion. Some intellects are cocky and free and want to hide that their hearts are crippled, proud, inoperable. They want to deny this. Now and then, even foolishness is a mask for an unholy, super certain knowledge. From this, one can infer that reverence for the mask belongs, belongs to a more sophisticated form of humanity that will not engage in an inopportune psychology or an invasive curiosity. So here we have one of the most famous, Nietzsche doesn't write this here, but one of the most famous things that Nietzsche ever wrote, as I'm sure you know, is that which does not kill me makes me stronger. Was mich nicht umbringt, macht mich stärker. He wrote that in Twilight of the Idols, which we will talk about. We will talk about that in a future video series. But I just want to say a few words here. Deep suffering, crisis, makes the free spirit more profound. Because whenever Nietzsche uses the pronoun me, mich, he's referring to the free spirit. So what he's saying is that deep suffering makes the free spirit profounder. Deep suffering deepens the free spirit. And deep suffering allows the free spirit to endure and to thrive in solitude. Deep suffering, crisis, makes the free spirit even more capable of enduring and thriving in solitude. And keep away from the free spirit, Nietzsche is suggesting. Keep away from the free spirit. All vulgar, invasive, pitying hands, the hands of pity. Because pity will rob the free spirit of his or her self-sufficiency, his or her autonomy. 271. What divides two people most deeply is a different sense and degree of cleanliness. All of the decency, all of the reciprocal utility, all of the goodwill in the world will not help. What matters is always the same. They cannot stand the way that those people reek. The lofty instinct for cleanliness forces the one burdened with it into the strangest and most threatening isolation. It is as if one were a saint. For saintliness is precisely what it is, the highest intellectualization of the aforesaid instinct. Some kind of shared knowledge of the superabundant joy that comes from bathing, some kind of zeal and craving that constantly drives the soul out of the night and into the morning, out of the cloudiness, out of the tribulation, and into brightness, radiance, profundity, finesse, as much as such a tendency makes a person distinctive. It is a distinguished tendency, it's forename. It also separates, right? So the instinct for cleanliness separates, makes a person more distinctive, more distinguished. The pity of the saint is pity for human scum, for all too human scum. There are degrees and heights where even pity is felt by him as a form of contamination, as filthiness. 272. A sign of elegance for Vornehmheit. Never consider lowering our obligations to the level of just anyone's obligations. Never have the desire to renounce our responsibility. Never have the desire to share our responsibility. Count our privileges and the performance of these privileges among our obligations. 273. Any human being who strives for greatness regards anyone he or she encounters on one's path as either a means to an end or as something that will slow one down or as an impedance. Or one will regard that person as a bed on which one can take a short rest. One's generosity toward one's fellow human beings is peculiar to the superior species to which one belongs. This generosity is only made possible when one is dominating and when one is at the zenith of one's powers. One is impatient and conscious that one has been condemned to play a role in a comedy until one reaches his or her height. For every war is a comedy and hides its goal in the way in which every means hides its goal. And all of this, the impatience of the great man or woman, and one's awareness that one had played a role in comedy, spoils all social intercourse for one. This is the kind of person who knows solitude and what is most poisonous about solitude. (274) The problem with the one who waits. Many fortunate and unpredictable events are necessary in order for a higher human being to explode, as they say. The solution to a problem is dormant within the higher human being. Only at the opportune time does one come to act. This usually does not happen, and in every corner of the earth there sit those who wait. They hardly know for how long they must wait. Few of them know that they are waiting in vain. From time to time the alarm bell will sound too late, that chance circumstance which will give them the permission to act. Then the best years of their youth and the power to act have been spent from sitting still for so long. And how many have found, right as they jump up in terror, that their limbs have fallen asleep and their spirit is already too heavy. It is too late, they say to themselves, marveling at themselves in disbelief, and from now on, forever useless. Should the handless Raphael be not the exception but the rule in the realm of genius? understanding the phrase handless Raphael in its broadest sense? Perhaps genius is not so rare. 500 hands are necessary, though, in order to tyrannize kairos, the opportune time. Kairos, the opportune time. In order to grab chance by the back of its head. 275. People who don't want to see someone's height will stare all the more keenly at whatever is low about him. They will stare at whatever is in the foreground. By doing so, they reveal the kind of people that they really are. So it's a bit like someone who comments on YouTube, a YouTube commentator who talks about the YouTube portraitists or theorists or lecturers' physical attributes instead of actually listening to what he or she is saying and talking about the way in which he or she says it in a more profound sense. You know, it's like a commentator who just looks at the superficial, because you see, if people can't win an argument, or if they can't make an argument, or if they can't interpret a text, or if they don't have anything intelligent to say, what they will do is they will focus on the surface. They will resort to argumentum ad hominem. Isn't that interesting? We see it all the time. And it's kind of a compliment when they do things like that, isn't it? 276, grosser, lowlier souls are better equipped to deal with every kind of hurt and loss than are more elegant souls, vornehm. The latter, the more elegant souls, are in much greater danger. The probability will be greater that they will face misfortune or be destroyed. Because of the multiplicity of their conditions for life, this danger is extraordinary. When a lizard loses a finger, the finger grows back. Not so with human beings. 277. Sufficiently terrible. The same old story. After your house is built, you notice something. You unwittingly learn something that you should have known before the building started. The eternal, miserable. Too late! The melancholy of all that is finished. 278. Wanderer, who are you? I see you going your way, contemptless, loveless, with an inscrutable gaze, damp and sad like a plummet, coming back up to the light from every depth unsatiated. What were you looking for down there? With a breast that never sighs, with lips that hide their disgust, with hand that only slowly grabs. Who are you? What did you do? Rest here. This place is hospitable to everyone. Relax. And whoever you might be, what would make you happy? What would make you relax? Just name it. I will offer you whatever I own. Relax? Relax? Oh, you curious one, what are you talking about? But give me, I ask you, what? Tell me. One more mask. A second mask. 279. When they are happy, people of deep sadness reveal who they really are. They have a means of grasping happiness as if they wanted to crush it and strangle it out of jealousy. Alas, they know too well that it will run away from them. 280. Terrible, terrible. What is this? Isn't he Retreating? Indeed. However, you understand him badly if you complain about that. He is retreating as one who is ready to make a great leap. 281. Will they believe me? But I demand to be believed. I have always been bad at thinking of myself, at thinking about myself, only thinking about myself in very rare cases. Only when forced to, and always without any pleasure in the matter. Always ready to deviate from me, and forever without faith in the results. Always coming from an ineluctable mistrust toward the possibility of self-knowledge. A mistrust that has even brought me to the point at which I feel a contradictio ad adiecto, a contradiction in terms. In the concept of immediate knowledge. Parenthetically, there is no such thing as immediate knowledge because knowledge is a mediator, right? Which is something that the theorists allow themselves to believe in. All of these facts are just about the most certain things that I know about myself. There has to be some kind of resistance in me toward believing anything determinate about myself. Is there a riddle therein? Probably. Fortunately, however, it is nothing for my teeth. Perhaps my resistance toward self-knowledge discloses the species to which I belong. But it doesn't disclose the name of the species to me, which is exactly how I wish it. 282. I think everyone has had this experience. You're at a restaurant and the food is not to your inclination. The food is not to your preference, not to your liking. You're disinclined toward the food. You find the food revolting. And you storm from the restaurant in disgust. And you leave a 1-star Yelp review for the restaurant or something. I don't know. Of course, I am filming this during the quarantine. So no one is going out to restaurants. No one is dining in at restaurants at the very least. Anyway, 282. What happened to you? I don't know, he said haltingly. Perhaps the harpies flew at me from across the table. These days, it happens every now and then, a mild-mannered, moderate, reserved human being will suddenly be thrown into a rage and smash dishes and turn over the table, screaming, raving, cursing the whole world. Finally, he will walk away, ashamed, furious at himself. Where did he go? For what reason did he leave? To starve himself alone, away from the others? To suffocate himself with the memory of what he did? A person who has the desires of a soul that is high-born and fastidious. A person who rarely finds his table set properly. A person who rarely finds his food well prepared. The danger will always be considerable for such a person. Today, however, the danger is absolutely extraordinary. Thrown into a noisy and mobbish age, having no desire to eat out of a single one of its bowls, he can easily die from hunger or thirst. Or if, despite everything, he finally digs in and eats, he could easily be annihilated by a sudden paroxysm of nausea. All of us have probably sat down at tables where we did not belong. And the most intellectual among us find it the hardest to nourish ourselves. We know the dangerous dyspepsia that originates from the sudden recognition of the kind of feed that we are eating, from the sudden disappointment with our fodder, the sudden disappointment with those who are sitting at our table, eating their dessert. Dessert nausea, which is how I translate the German Nachtisch Ekel. That is a Kofferwort. Kofferwort is a portmanteau, right? A suitcase word, which is what it means in French and in English. Well, French and in German. So, yeah, that's how I translated it. 283. Assuming that one wants to dispense any praise at all, it is a sophisticated and at the same time elegant form of self-mastery to praise something that one does not agree with. Otherwise, one would be praising oneself, which is invidious to good taste. Of course, this is a form of self-mastery that provides other people with a good opportunity and an incentive to constantly misunderstand the one who is giving out praise. In order to permit yourself this real luxury of taste and morality, you have to avoid living among intellectual idiots. Moreover, you have to live among such people whose misunderstandings and errors are amusing because of their sophistication. Otherwise, you will pay the price. He praised me, thus he did me a service. This inferential asininity ruins half of our lives, the lives of us hermits. For such asininity in drawing inferences brings the asses into our neighborhoods, into our friendships. 284. Living with an extraordinary and proud serenity, always on the other side, having one's affects voluntarily, not having one's affects, having one's for and against, not having any for or against, condescending to assume a for or an against for a few hours. Riding them as if one were riding horses, sometimes riding them as if they were donkeys. You have to know how to use their stupidity as if it were fire. Keeping in reserve one's 300 surfaces, even wearing sunglasses. For there are moments when no one should be allowed to see our eyes. Not to mention there are also moments when no one should be allowed to see our reasons. Choosing for one's company that mischievous and gleeful vice known as politeness. Staying master of one's four virtues: courage, insight, empathy, solitude. Solitude is one of our virtues, for it is a sublime tendency and an urge toward cleanliness. Solitude gives us a suspicion that contact between human and human in society inevitably makes one unclean. Every form of communality makes somehow, somewhere, sometime, everything common. (285) The greatest events and thoughts, though the greatest thoughts are the greatest events, will be comprehended last. Contemporary generations will never experience such events. They will live past them. It is a bit like what happens in the stellar realm. The light from the most distant stars comes to human beings last. And before that light arrives, human beings deny that stars exist. How many centuries does a mind require in order to be comprehended? That is also a standard of measurement which creates a necessary hierarchy and etiquette for minds as for stars. 286. Here the vista is free, the mind is lifted. There is, however, an inverse kind of human being who is also at the apex, and who has also a free prospect. But this type of human being looks down. I'd like to read that again. The quotation is actually from Goethe, from Faust II, Faust Part 2. And the lines are spoken by Dr. Marianus. He says in German, "Hier ist die Aussicht frei, der Geist erhoben." So let me reread that. There is, however, an inverse kind of human being who is also at the apex and who also has a free prospect. But this type of human being looks down. 287. What is distinguished? Was ist vornehm? What does the word distinguished, vornehm, mean to us? How does one identify someone who is distinguished? How does one recognize a distinguished human being under the heavy, overcast sky of the burgeoning ochlocracy, which darkens everything and makes everything heavy as lead? It is not one's actions which reveal who is distinguished. Actions are forever ambiguous. Actions are forever ambiguous, forever unfathomable. Nor is it one's works. There are more than enough people among artists and scholars who reveal through their work their deep desire to become distinguished, to become vornehm. It is precisely this demand for distinction that is alien to the needs of the distinguished soul. In fact, the demand for distinction is the loquacious and dangerous mark of its absence. It is not works, but rather faith that is decisive here, right? And Nietzsche is alluding, of course, to Luther and Lutheran Protestantism, right? Faith establishes the hierarchy to absorb an ancient religious formula into a new and deeper understanding. There is a kind of fundamental certainty that the distinguished soul has for itself. This certainty cannot be sought or found. Perhaps it also cannot be lost. The distinguished soul is in awe of itself. 288. There are people who have intellect in an inevitable manner. They might turn and twist as they like. They might hold their hands before their treacherous eyes, as if the hands weren't capable of betrayal. Finally, it comes out that they have something that they tried to conceal, namely intellect, one of the most sophisticated means of deceiving other people for as long as possible and successfully appearing more stupid than you really are, which is as desirable in everyday life as an umbrella, is called enthusiasm. Now that is not Schwärmerei, okay? That is in German, die Begeisterung, including what belongs to it, such as virtue. For, as Galliani says, who certainly knew about such things,
Vertu est enthousiasme.
Merci, Simone. Merci bien. Obviously, that means virtue is enthusiasm, right? Okay. 289. You can always hear an echo in the writings of a hermit, forever the echo of the wasteland, forever the sound of whispering, and the shy looking around of solitude. From one's most powerful words, from one's screaming, resounds a new and more dangerous kind of solitude, of self-withholding. Whoever has sat with his soul, or her soul, year in and year out, day in and day out, in confidential dialogue, in confidential debate, whoever has become a cave bear, or a grave robber, or the guardian of a treasure and a dragon, whoever has sat there in one's cave, it might be a labyrinth or a gold shaft, One's very concepts will get a twilight color, an odor that smells as much of depth as it does of mildew, something incommunicative and resistant, something that blows its cold wind on every passerby. The hermit never believes that a philosopher expresses his or her real and final opinions in books, assuming that such a philosopher was originally a hermit oneself. Isn't that just why people write books? To keep what they hide to themselves? The hermit will question whether a philosopher can even have final and real opinions at all. One will question whether at the back of every cavern there might not be another cavern. One will question whether there must not be another cavern at the back of every cavern, a wider, stranger, richer world beyond every surface, an abyss beneath every ground, beneath every grounding. Every philosophy is a foreground philosophy. Such is the judgment of the hermit. There is something arbitrary about the fact that he is staying here and not there. There is something arbitrary about the way he is looking backward and looking around himself. Something arbitrary about the fact that he isn't digging deeper right here. Something arbitrary about the fact that he isn't tossing the spade aside. There is something suspicious about that. End of quotation. Every philosophy also conceals another philosophy. Every opinion is also a form of concealment. Every word is also a mask. 290. Every profound thinker is more afraid of becoming understood than of becoming misunderstood. In the latter case, becoming misunderstood would perhaps hurt the thinker's vanity. In the former case, however, becoming understood would wound his or her heart, one's empathy, which forever speaks these words. Oh, why do you want to have it so difficult? Why do you want it to be as difficult for you as it is for me? 291. The human being is a multitudinous, mendacious, artful, and opaque beast, a beast that seems uncanny to other beasts, not so much because it is powerful, but because it is crafty and clever. The human beast has invented the good conscience in order to enjoy its own soul someday, as if that soul were something simple. And the whole of morality is a long, hardy falsification to make it possible for the human beast to view its soul with pleasure. From this perspective, there is much more in the concept of art than one commonly believes. 292. A philosopher is a human being who constantly experiences, sees, hears, surmises, hopes, and dreams extraordinary things. One is struck by one's own thoughts, as if encountering them from the outside, from above, and from below. As if one were struck by one's type of events and lightning bolts. Oneself is perhaps a kind of storm which is pregnant with new lightning flashes. One is a catastrophic human being, a calamitous human being, around whom there is forever rumbling and humming and gaping, and everything is uncanny. A philosopher, alas, a being who often runs away from oneself and often is afraid of oneself. However, one is curious enough to return to oneself again and again and again and again and again. A man who says, 293, a man who says, I like that, I will take it for myself, and I will protect it and defend it against anyone. A man who wants to pursue a matter, a man who wants to carry out a decision, a man who wants to be true to a thought, a man who wants to hold on to a woman, a man who wants to punish an impertinent overbold character and throw him down. A man who has his wrath and his sword, a man who the weak, the suffering, the oppressed, even animals like to go to, and who belong to him by nature. Basically, a man who is naturally master. If such a man has pity, well, this pity has value then. But who cares about the pity of someone who suffers? Or the pity of someone who sermonizes pity? Who cares? There is today almost everywhere in Europe a diseased delicateness and sickly sensitivity to pain. In the same way, there is a repulsive intemperateness in lamentation, a softness which gussies itself up into something higher with the help of religion and philosophical bric-a-brac. There is a formal cult of suffering. The unmanliness, which is christened as pity in such exalted circles, I believe, is what always appears first to your eye. This latest form of bad taste must be warded off vigorously and thoroughly. And finally, I wish that people will put the amulet of Guy Saber on their hearts and around their necks. Guy Saber means the gay science, to translate it into English. 294, the Olympian vice. Against that philosopher who, being a real Englishman, tried to defame laughter to all thinking minds, Hobbes. Hobbes. Laughter is an awful oddment of human nature that every thinking mind will strive to overcome. Hobbes. If I were permitted a hierarchy of philosophers according to the tier of their laughter, up to those who are capable of a golden laughter, Nietzsche would be at the top, and Hobbes would be at the bottom. Yeah. I mean, even Kant told a joke. There's one joke in the Kritik der reinen Vernunft. So Kant is at a higher level on that scale than Hobbes is. If I were permitted a hierarchy of philosophers according to the tier of their laughter, up to those who are capable of a golden laughter, given that even the gods philosophize, a conclusion to which I have been urged many times, I have no doubt that they know how to laugh in a suprahuman and new manner, and at the expense of all serious things. Gods take pleasure in mockery. It seems as if they can't refrain from laughing, even at holy acts. (295). Now here we're going to listen to a paean to the great god Dionysus. And he is called by Nietzsche in German, der Versuchergott. Versucher could be translated, well, Versuchergott could be translated as the experimenting god or as the tempter god. 295, the genius of the heart, possessed by the great hidden one, the experimenting god, the tempting god, the one who was born to be the rat catcher of the conscience. That's probably an allusion to the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, by William Shakespeare. Whose voice knows how to descend into the underworld of every soul, the one whose every word, whose every glance conveys carefulness and a fold of seduction, the one whose sovereignty understands how to appear differently than what he is. More so, he knows how to compel his followers to come closer to him. He knows how to make them follow him more intimately, more thoroughly. I hope that no one has an image before one of Nietzsche worshiping at the altar of Dionysus, as if Nietzsche constructed a shrine to Dionysus and is sacrificing in the name of Dionysus. Nietzsche doesn't actually believe that there is a god named Dionysus. So Nietzsche is interested in what Dionysus represents, which is the aesthetical sense of the Dionysian, which he writes about in The Birth of Tragedy out of the spirit of music. More so, he knows how to compel his followers to come closer to him. He knows how to make them follow him more intimately, more thoroughly. The genius of the heart, he who silences every sound and every form of self-complacency, he who teaches how to listen, he who smooths rough souls and gives them the taste of a new desire. He makes them as silent as a mirror that reflects the deep sky. The genius of the heart, who teaches the foolish and the impulsive hand to hesitate and to grasp in a more decorous manner. The genius of the heart, who surmises the existence of a hidden and forgotten treasure. The genius of the heart, who divines the droplet of goodness and sweet spirituality beneath the dark and the thick sheet of ice. Beneath the dark and thick sheet of ice, the genius of the heart, the one who serves as the dowsing rod for every grain of gold that has been long buried in a dungeon of sludge and sand. The genius of the heart, the one who enriches everyone he comes into contact with. He does not ennoble or surprise, as if blessing and oppressing someone with a strange gift. Rather, he makes them richer in themselves, newer than ever before, broken open as if thawed by a balmy gust, as if they now could be heard. Perhaps they are less secure than before. Perhaps they are the more delicate, more fragile, more fragmented than before. However, they are now full of hopes that are still nameless. They are now overflowing with a new will and a new surge. They are now overflowing with a new non-will and a new counter-surge. Well, what am I doing, my friends? What am I talking about? Whom am I talking about? Whom am I telling you about? Have I forgotten so much that I can't even name his name? Unless it be the case that you have already guessed yourselves who this questionable spirit, who this questionable God is, who would be praised in such a fashion. As with everyone who has been on the go from childhood, as has happened to everyone who has been in the foreign lands, since walking with a child's legs, so it has come to pass with me. I have crossed paths with many strange spirits who are not harmless. Above all, however, the one of whom I spoke has crossed my path again and again. He is no less than the god Dionysus, that great ambiguous one, the experimenting god, the tempting god, the one to whom, as you know, I sacrificed my firstborn child in all secrecy and fearful reverence, right? Again, Nietzsche's firstborn child is his first published book, which is called The Birth of Tragedy out of the Spirit of Music, which concerns the Apollinian and the Dionysian, right? And by the way, Jordan Peterson, who writes about order versus chaos, borrows that doublet, borrows that dyad from Nietzsche. The Apollinian represents chaos. The Apollinian represents order. Chaos is represented by the Dionysian. For I found no one who could have understood what I did back then. Let me pause. In the meantime, I learned much more, too much, about the philosophy of this god, a knowledge that has been transmitted from mouth to mouth. I, the last acolyte and initiate of the god Dionysus. And might I be permitted finally to begin my work, my friends, to give you a little taste of this philosophy, as much as I am allowed to, with a soft voice as is courteous. For this philosophy concerns much that is arcane, much that is new, much that is uncommon, much that is fantastical, much that is spooky. The idea that Dionysus is a philosopher, the idea that even the gods philosophize, seems like news to me. a piece of news that is hardly uncontroversial, and that might even excite mistrust among philosophers. Among you, my friends, such an idea would receive less opposition, unless it come too late and at an unpropitious time. For I have been informed that you are not fond of believing these days in God or in gods. Perhaps as I tell my story, I even have to go further with my candor than the strict habits of your ears would prefer. Certainly the God in question went further in such dialogues, much, much further, and was always many steps ahead of me. Indeed, I would like, if it were permissible, to give him lovely solemn names of grandeur and virtue, according to the rules of human usage. I would boast of his courage in research and discover, of his bold honesty, truthfulness, and love of wisdom. However, a God such as this would have nothing to do with all of this honorable, sumptuous junk. He would say, keep this praise to yourselves, and to those who are like you, and whomever else has need of it. I have no reason to bedizen my nudity. The suspicion arises that this type of divinity and philosopher perhaps lacks shame. About this matter, he once said, I love humanity under certain circumstances. He alluded to Ariadne, who was present as he was speaking. The human being is, to my mind, an agreeable, audacious, inventive animal that has no equal upon the earth, an animal that finds its way out of every labyrinth. I am good to this creature. I think often of this beast, how I impel it and make it stronger, eviler, and profounder than it is. I ask, terrified, stronger, eviler, and profounder? He says again, indeed, stronger, eviler, and profounder, and also lovelier. And with this, the experimenting God, the tempting God, grinned with his halcyon grin, as if he said something enchantingly gracious. You could see it right here. This divinity lacks more than just shame. But you can also see that there are perfectly good reasons to presume that we can teach the gods a thing or two. We human beings, we are more human. 296, we are winding up. Oh, what are you then, you, my written and painted thoughts? Not too long ago, you were so vivid, so young, and so malicious, full of barbs and hidden spices that made me laugh and sneeze. And now, already, you've taken off your young person's clothes, and a few of you are, I'm afraid, ready to become truths. You already look so immortal, so heartbreakingly upstanding, so boring. And were things any different back then? What things we wrote out back then, what things we painted out. We mandarins with our Chinese paintbrushes, we eternalizers of things that let themselves be written. What are we then capable of painting out? Alas, only that which is already wilting and begins to stench. Alas, forever only storm clouds after they have exhausted themselves and withdrawn. And golden post-date feelings. Alas, Forever only birds that flew with fatigue and then had done with their flying and let themselves be caught by our hands. We externalize what lives no longer, what no longer can fly, only worn out and outworn things. And it is our afternoon, my written and painted thoughts, for which only I have colors, perhaps many colors, many vivid delicatenesses, and 50 yellows and browns and greens and reds. But no one suspects how you looked in your morning, you unpredicted sparks and wonders of my solitude, you, my old, beloved, awful thoughts. So that concludes the prose section of Beyond Good and Evil, the fragmentary prose section. There is a poem that awaits us, and I will recite my translation of that poem in the next video. My name is Joseph Suglia, S-U-G-L-I-A is how one spells my surname. This has been video 14 of my series, in which I read my English translation of Jenseits von Gut und Böse, Vorspiel, einer Philosophie der Zukunft. Until next time, I'm signing out and signing off. Thank you very much.